Hello there, Intro to Philosophy students. You're winding up the course. You're now in one of the later chapters, that is on ethics and morality. This is Dr. Martin, and I've worked with you on the art and aesthetics chapter, which I hope that unit went well for you. This unit is divided into 5 different sections. It spans from Aristotle, who begins with from the 3rd century, 4th century BCE, all the way to 19th century diplomat, this politician and philosopher John Stuart Mill. So you think of ethics and morality, and Mill was thinking about this as he was in the British Parliament and how some of his theories would coincide there. So here's a hypothetical. I asked you some study questions about how ethics and morality could relate to your own life. I just went for a walk with my dog, and there were some packages out on someone's front porch. When you think about stealing, which of course is wrong, but the idea would be, how does one derive an ethos against stealing? Where does it come from? But for our philosophers, many of them are thinking in terms of the personal desire versus the public good, and the conflict in that in-between space between personal want, and that is private want, and public good. They often see a schism between the two. I didn't take the packages, by the way. So, but the idea would be, think about how ethics and morality applies to your life. The 5 readings, which have been condensed, are from British philosophers mainly. You've got John Stuart Mill. You also have German philosophers, Immanuel Kant, and the Greek philosopher Aristotle. And if you can think about them in sequence, and if you can just get the main idea from each one. These readings are heavy. You're taking a dual enrollment course. We don't expect you to master these readings. But if you can get the main gist of a given reading, for example, what does Immanuel Kant mean when we talk about the categorical imperative? You know it's Kant because it's long. He goes into dense philosophy. He's not numbered like Bentham and others had sequenced theories in their work. But if you could figure out what he means by the categorical imperative, and what he means is a philosophical concept that is a priori. A priori means happens beforehand. A posteriori happens after one has the experience. But how does one have a categorical idea that something is an idea out in nature? I know it's hard to think about, but what Kant is dealing with things or the same ideas that he dealt with in his famous 3 critiques, including the critique of pure judgment, and how one comes to adjudge something. So a categorical imperative, if we can go to Kant real quick for a second. I mean, he goes into, this is about, I don't know, halfway into his piece. In this problem, we will first inquire whether the mere conception of a categorical imperative may not perhaps supply us with the formula also of it, containing the proposition which alone can be a categorical imperative. For even if we know the tenor of such an absolute command, yet how it is possible will require further special and laborious study, which we will postpone to the last section. He talks about the hypothetical imperative. In general, I do not know beforehand what it will contain until I'm given the condition. But when I conceive a categorical imperative, I know at once what it contains. This would be an a priori concept, remember beforehand, of the way that something is governed. Here would be the realm of ethics. And it would be a proposition that would probably be true in all occasions and all contexts. So Kant is dealing with that. He's talking about a hypothetical imperative. An imperative is basically a directive. A category is the way that we think. So again, if you can get the basic, right? And what I mean by basic, if you can figure out what Bentham means by utility, what John Stuart Mills means by utilitarianism, what Aristotle means by virtue, that's all I want you to get from this unit. I want you to get the main ideas, right? I don't expect you to read every single part of Kant, by the way, or Hume. Those are longer ones. Um, Bentham and Mill are shorter. So is Aristotle. So when Aristotle's talking about virtues, um, and the idea would be for this chapter, he's the beginning of it, right? So he's the one that starts off the chapter. Um, he means within the world of action. He says he's basically, if you think about the Greek polis, the political state of Greece, um, and the idea that one to be a democratic citizen, little d, would be participating in democracy. And so what he means is ethics and morality derived from the world of action, right? And he's talking about virtue as a concept. And these are ideas we're still grappling with for today. Utilitarianism with John Stuart Mill. And again, if you can just get that idea, that's all I'm looking for. It's the same idea that's repeated throughout it, right? I'm not asking you to read every single word. I'm not asking you to understand every single concept. But utilitarianism and utility, it goes back to the previous example that we talked about. A private desire, a private want versus a public good. And the idea would be utilitarianism, it would create the greatest good amongst the most amount of people. Think about a policy, a government policy or something like that. I wish, by the way, there are more examples in these chapters. There are a couple, including suicide during Kant, and a statesman giving an oration during Hume. I wish there were more examples. But if you can start thinking about how ethics and morality could apply to your own life and some of the things that we are grappling with in the 21st century American life, I think that this chapter would be more manageable to you. Let me mention a couple more things, and then I'll end the discussion. So the last reading is John Stuart Mill, and he's a famous philosopher. And what you're reading is his theories of utilitarianism. And the thing I wanted you to note, and if I have a quiz, this would be something I'd probably ask on it. It would be the way he argues is called via negativo. He's arguing the obverse. Instead of saying what he believes, he's saying this is what it is not. And he means that for morality. He says this is what morality is not. This is not what utilitarianism means, right? He's going over the misconceptions. So he's arguing the obverse of what he means so that you can get to the gist of what he means, if that makes sense. So via negativo, right, is the way that John Stuart Mill is structuring his belief system. Jeremy Bentham, he's an early precursor for the panopticon. That is a theory that French theorist Michel Foucault played with, but it's the idea that something's watching at all times, and it's a way of changing changing human behavior. That's not what we're dealing with here. Bentham is talking about pleasure. So if there's a word that's repeated throughout these readings, denote that word. And he's talking about utility. And this notion that, it's interesting. We're talking about ethics and morality. And he's talking about issues of pleasure. And I think he's describing pleasure in a way that you could say, no, it's not in conflict with ethics and morality, but how pleasure has its own limitations and what a pleasurable idea could maybe be in contrast with the public good. So I keep going back to this notion of a private want and a public good. I don't see them as being completely contradictory, but for the most part, much of the readings that you did for this unit deal with that. And so let me just pull up a piece from one of the later philosophers, and then we can call it a day. When you read Hume, he's one of the first ones, by the way, you can skip to section 2. It's on benevolence, and that's where he starts to espouse his idea. Section 1 is basically a setup without saying what his beliefs are. But you could go ahead and skip to section 2 on Hume. It's on benevolence, and he goes into morality and ethics in that regard. But if we're talking about, utilitarianism, you start getting in utility, which are the main concepts of this unit. When you get to Jeremy Bentham on the principle of utility, and for me, when I'm looking at this, this is about 3/4 to 2/3 of the way in. Here's what he means by utility. This is section 3, chapter 1, very beginning of Jeremy Bentham on the principle of utility, note that he's numbered. He's completely manageable. It's numbered. Here's what he says. By utility is meant that property in any object whereby it tends to produce benefit, advantage, pleasure, good, or happiness. All this, in the present case, comes to the same thing. Or, what comes again to the same thing, to prevent the happening of mischief, pain, evil, or unhappiness to the party whose interest is considered. If that party be the community in general, then the happiness of the community. If a particular individual, then the happiness of that individual. He says in the next section, section 4, the community is a fictitious body composed of the individual persons who are considered as constituting, as it were, its members. The interest of the community then is what is it? The sum of the interests of the several members who compose it. So, you could see what he's describing utility, the greatest good or application to the most amount of people, think of a government policy. And the way that idea, a communal utility, is different than, he says, against personal, the interest of the individual persons versus the interest of the community as a whole. He says the community is an imagined group, right? They're not actually physically there. They are an imagined group of actors in a social and political and cultural system. So you've got an interesting discussion going on there. It's utility, utilitarianism, pleasure, morals, virtue. I'm sure I'm forgetting something here. Categorical imperative. You get those ideas down, you could skim the major parts of this chapter and make sense of it. I don't think it's going to overwhelm you too much. It is heady, it is difficult, but you completely got it. I went over the gist of what what you'll do this week. You get those ideas down, we are in good shape. It's been a pleasure. Good luck.